Marco Mendicino is the Minister of Public Safety. Minister, it's good to talk to you again.
Thanks for having me.
You say you're going to appoint a special rapporteur. Your government is. There's an urgency to do this. When are we going to see this appointment?
As quickly as possible. We're talking days, weeks, certainly not months. And since yesterday's announcement where we said we would be appointing a special rapporteur, someone who possesses the qualifications, the expertise to put forward the best possible options to shed light on the allegations, which we take very seriously. More importantly, we have said that whatever those recommendations are, including and up to a public inquiry, we will respect them. Canadians need to know that this is a government that will do whatever is necessary to protect our democratic institutions and our elections, and it's one that is not a partisan issue.
Days, weeks, does that mean we're going to have this before the end of March, 100%? Are we in that kind of a time frame? Because weeks could spill into April, and, you know, we are in a minority parliament, so, like, how will it be this month?
I think you can be reassured that we are going to move as quickly as possible. We are going to make sure that we survey the options and appoint someone who is an authority in the area, someone who understands how to navigate national security, protect the individuals that work in that space, protect the technology and the techniques that we use to not only protect our institutions, but Canadians writ large, but also balance those needs against the need to be transparent. And that is something that we have taken great strides on with the creation of NCCOP and NCIRA, but we recognize there's always more to do. And we will take that work very seriously.
So the Prime Minister says he's going to consult with the opposition parties, the opposition leaders, presumably, on who this person will be. What's the benchmark here for consensus? What if there is no consensus with the opposition leaders on who to appoint to this job? What do you do then as a government?
Well, I think our track record shows that where we put our heads collectively together, that we can find compromise. We've done that through the creation and the appointment of members of the NCCOP, which brings members of all of the recognized parties in the chamber, including senators, together. And that is a forum that has actually generated some very merit-based recommendations in the space, including the creation of a coordinator, which we said earlier yesterday that we would announce. And I think if we, again, do not descend into the fray, and at times, you know, we've seen the Conservatives do that, I think it's regrettable, and we recognize that we have a mutual and shared interest in protecting our institutions and protecting the integrity of our elections, that we can see our way across the aisle and do this work together.
But you're praising NCCOP, and you were in question period today. The Conservatives are dismissing that as a secretive committee that reports to the Prime Minister and has to keep everything in secret. Mr. Poilievre was mocking the idea of a special rapporteur, you know, calling it a fake job and asking if it came with a cape, for example. So, I mean, how do you get any kind of a consensus there? It feels like you will likely have to appoint someone over the objections of your main rival in the Conservatives, don't you think?
Well, we're going to work hard at it, and we're going to extend every effort to all parties, including the Conservatives. But I think you're also right, David, to point out that Mr. Poilievre seems to be bending over backwards to make this a political and a partisan issue. He knows full well that the members of the NCCOP also are comprised of Conservative members, and that members of that committee have found unanimity in putting forward recommendations which are transparent and are there for all to see. And so I hope that the Conservatives will stop with the political bantering and partisanship, which does not advance the cause of protecting our institutions, and rather take a responsible and measured tone to do this work together. Because you're right, Canadians need to be assured that when they cast a ballot at the box, that they and they alone are the ones that determine the outcomes of our elections.
Well, there's been a fair amount of partisanship on this from a lot of people. I mean, very early in the unfolding of this story, Jennifer O'Connell compared questions the Conservatives were asking to Trumpism and election denialism. So, like, things kind of got off on the wrong foot in the very early stage of it, which is why the Prime Minister said last night to take the partisanship out of it, let's go to this special rapporteur. So do you have a short list of people who are being vetted and considered for this job? Does your government have that?
We're putting one together, and like I said, we are going to engage with opposition parties, and I will say that we've put in place already a number of mechanisms that either seek to bridge the partisan divide, including through the creation of NCCOP, which has produced work that is there for Canadians to see, or have appointed the most senior nonpartisan professional public servants through the creation of the site panel, which has verified that the elections in 2019 and 2021 were both free and fair. I think if we do that, and we do that work in conjunction with the special rapporteur, that we can see our way to a recommended option, which this government will respect. And that is critically important so that we can reassure Canadians that their institutions will hold against the threat of foreign interference. That is something that we must do.
Okay, that's where I wanted to go next, because if the special rapporteur appointment is going to take days, potentially weeks to get done, one of the first orders of business the Prime Minister wants this person to work on is deciding whether or not there should be a public inquiry, and the government has promised to abide by that decision. How quickly do you expect this person to be in place and then make the decision on the inquiry? Because there is an urgency to move quickly on this. So what kind of a timeline are we talking about here?
Well, again, I think we want to be as expeditious as we can, because we know that this is an issue that matters to Canadians, and providing them with transparency is a way in which we can reinforce confidence in our institutions. So we're going to reflect on that. We're also going to reflect on the terms of the mandate, which will be given to the special rapporteur, which I think needs to be appropriately calibrated to the questions around the allegations, which again we take very seriously. And so that work will carry forward. We understand that this is important. We understand that this is urgent. We are going to work with opposition parties to come to some consensus about the individual. We'll give that individual the mandate that they need to do the job of surveying the options. They're also going to provide a bit of a coordinating role with NCCOP and NCIRA, both of whom have been engaged as well. You heard the Prime Minister say that he spoke with retired Supreme Court Judge Deschamps, who is the chair of the NCIRA, as well as the chair of the NCCOP, and that is David McGuinty. So it's urgent work. We're going to do it as quickly as we can, but we also want to make sure that we get this process right.
So it's urgent work, and I understand then the need to do it with precision and not just with speed. But if there is a public inquiry, and it seems hard to find a path where we don't go to one based on where things are right now, that is no small thing. That is going to take months, if not years, to get done. We're in a minority parliament. We could have an election this fall, next spring, next fall. You know, there is a requirement to get the safeguards in place as rapidly as possible. So what do you do on that front to make sure that the protections are in place before next election, even if the public inquiry is still ongoing?
Well, first, we've got a track record of cooperating with institutions, including public inquiries, having just concluded the one that examined the circumstances around the invocation of the Emergencies Act. I testified before that commission for 8 hours. My colleagues did as well.
But is that the sort of timeline you envision?
But I was going to come back to what I thought was the core of your question, which is what are you doing in the meantime? And I think this is critical, because even as we embark upon the special rapporteur process, who will put forward processes, this government is being proactive through taking concrete action. We've already put in place a number of new authorities that enable our national security agencies to address and mitigate against the threat of foreign interference. We put in place legislation to crack down on foreign funding which could interfere with elections. But we've also made sure that as we've taken each and every one of those steps, that those authorities respect the fundamental rights of the Charter, because that is extremely important. And I can tell you, as a former federal prosecutor, having worked in this space, that this is a government that will always respect those principles, as well as being upfront with Canadians in the way in which we do this work.
But you look at the urgency and the uncertainty that's out there. I mean, no one disagrees that China and others are trying to meddle in the elections. The question is how effective it is and what impact it's having. People want to know before that next election happens, that they want clear answers and clarity on this thing. So if it does go to a public inquiry, and I know we're leaping ahead a couple of steps in the chain here, does it need to be something with the sort of tighter timeframes like the Rouleau report had, or is this something that can sprawl into multiple years? Because it seems like that would not necessarily be dealing with the issue quickly enough for Canadians right now.
I'm confident that the special rapporteur will have the mandate, the terms of reference, and the scope to put forward recommendations that may include a public inquiry, as well as some timelines that are sensitive to the pressing nature of the questions that Canadians are posing. But I think more critically, in the meantime, Canadians can be assured that we have put in place the protections that are necessary to uphold our elections. We have 2 site panels who have put forward conclusions as well as recommendations. You've heard my colleague, Minister LeBlanc, who is the minister that is charged with the responsibility of protecting our institutions, say that we are committed to implementing the recommendations that are listed in the Rosenberg report in cooperation with the public service. We will do that. We will take the recommendations of the Special Rapporteur. We will continue to make sure that we are upfront with Canadians so that they can be confident in our institutions as well as our elections.
Is there any doubt in your mind now that we're going to head to a public inquiry with everything that has happened, having to take this extraordinary step? The Prime Minister is delegating his decision-making authority on this to an as-yet-to-be-named individual. Given the extraordinary circumstances, is there any doubt in your mind we're going to be headed to a public inquiry on this?
Well, I think it's a fair question, but I don't want to usurp the role of the Special Rapporteur. I think it's important that this person is able to carry on their work, unencumbered by any going in with any biases or any leanings. I mean, this is somebody who, again, will possess the knowledge, the know-how, the competence to survey all of the options which are there and put forward the best possible recommendations on the next steps that we need to take, not only as a government, but as a country. And I know that Canadians are concerned about this, and that is one of the reasons why we made the announcement for the Special Rapporteur. That's why, in addition to that, later this week, we hope to put forward the official commencement of a consultation, a conversation on the creation of a foreign agent registry. That's why, in addition to that, we've launched the coordinator within my public safety ministry to take the work very seriously, to push back against foreign interference, because these threats are real. But in the meantime, our institutions are holding, and we'll continue to be upfront with Canadians about all of that work because we know it's important to them.
Okay, Minister Mendicino, thanks for coming in.
Thank you.
Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, meanwhile, is not happy with the Prime Minister's handling of these interference allegations, and today he ramped up his rhetoric.
It is actually incredible that we have this uprising at our intelligence body. Well, they've been warning him for years about this. And what has he done? He's covered it up, even encouraged it to continue. And so they are so concerned about how the Prime Minister is acting against Canada's interests and in favor of a foreign dictatorship's interests that they are actually releasing this information publicly.
Michael Chong is a Conservative's foreign affairs critic. Mr. Chong, thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
I want to get your reaction to Minister Mendicino, but first I want to get your thoughts on your leader's remarks there, that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is acting against Canada's interest and in favor of a foreign dictatorship's interest. Do you share that view?
Well, I think there's real questions that have to be raised about what the Prime Minister knew and when about Beijing's foreign interference during and before our elections. For it's been clear now since these news stories first broke, these investigative journalism stories first broke about 3 months ago, that the Prime Minister has known about this foreign interference for years. CSIS advised the Prime Minister that it was a national threat, that it was a serious threat, that it undermined the integrity of our democratic institutions, threatened to undermine social cohesion, the economy, long-term prosperity, and fundamental rights and freedoms of Canadians. This is all the advice that he was given by CSIS. And yet he failed to take any action until the public was informed about it because of pieces that were published in Global News and by the Globe and Mail.
But acting in favor of a foreign dictatorship's interests is a very powerful phrase. I mean, in effect, is your party accusing the Prime Minister of betraying Canada's interests to work on behalf of Beijing here?
Well, I think it's clear that the government, the Prime Minister in particular, didn't heed the advice of CSIS.
There's not heeding and there's acting deliberately on behalf of a foreign power's interests. There's a gulf between those two.
Agreed. And what I'm saying is that he failed to come clean with Canadians and to heed the advice of CSIS to treat this foreign interference as the serious threat it is and to come public with information about the details of this foreign interference, another thing that CSIS advised the Prime Minister to do. And so I think there's real questions about why the Prime Minister failed to take action, failed to come clean about this foreign interference, failed to treat it seriously when it was brought to his attention years ago.
Well, he's certainly acting now. We saw the press conference last night where he spoke for nearly an hour and he announced the plans to appoint a special rapporteur. He says he's going to consult with the opposition parties on this, on who that person will be. Conservatives are very skeptical about this. Will you engage in that consultation with the Prime Minister? Or do you think this is a worthy process?
Well, the Prime Minister in the past has shown himself not to be serious about consulting with opposition parties on the appointment of new individuals to senior posts in Parliament, in government, in a number of things that have happened over this government over the last 8 years. I think what the Prime Minister is doing, what this government is doing, is burying the truth under a mountain of process. We've got two secret committees, NCIRA and NSICOP, looking at this issue. We've got a special rapporteur who's going to be appointed at some future date. We've got a range of other processes, the site task force that was set up, the critical election incident protocol that was set up. We've got a range of processes that have been set up. What the government is not doing is it's not coming clean with the truth of what is happening. It's not heeding the advice of CSIS. CSIS has said two things. First, foreign interference is a serious national threat, a serious threat to the security of this country. The second thing they've said is that a tool available to the government is to be transparent, to use sunshine and transparency to shed a light on what is going on, because that will build resilience amongst Canadians. If you let Canadians, Canadian communities, other levels of government know the details of foreign interference threat activities, you actually build resilience in the population to protect Canadians up against this foreign interference. But on both those pieces of advice, the government has failed to act.
The key way to get the sunshine and transparency you're talking about is this public inquiry that you and the other opposition parties are talking about, and certainly former senior people in the national security apparatus of the country have been advocating for. The special rapporteur seems to be the on-ramp to that, right? Because they will be gifted with the authority to make that decision. So have you got an idea of who that person should be and what that should look like?
I don't. And I agree, a public inquiry would shed some light on it. My concern is that it's going to lead to further delay. Look, the government has the information about who is involved with this, with Beijing's foreign interference in the 2019 election, in the 2021 election. They can come clean with that information and tell us who's involved. Maybe my campaign was targeted in the 2019 and 2021 election campaigns. But I, as an election candidate, can't take action to put donors on a ban list, to say to certain campaign volunteers, you're not welcome to volunteer on my campaign, if I don't know who the agents are acting on behalf of Beijing. The government knows who these individuals are. This is what all these investigative stories that have been appearing in the media have been all about. So they need to tell us who is involved, and then political parties, candidates can take action to protect our democracy and our institutions.
But how do they have to declassify information to do that? Is it, how do you make that? They would have to take those steps.
Yeah, it's not up to the head of CSIS or other intelligence agencies to tell the public what is going on. That's a decision of the Prime Minister and his cabinet. You know, a good parallel with all of this is President Biden in the lead up to the war in Ukraine. U.S. intelligence went to the president and said, we've got highly classified information that concludes with a great deal of confidence that Russia is about to attack Ukraine. But the decision about releasing this information is not on us. It's on you, Mr. President, to let the world know what is going on. And President Biden did exactly that months before the invasion. And in doing so, he built resilience amongst Western democracies in preparing for this invasion. The Prime Minister can do the same thing here when it comes to Beijing's meddling in our democracy. He can tell Canadians about what is going on so that they are forewarned and forearmed about these interference activities, building resilience.
The key thing you said, though, is that the intelligence agencies went to President Biden with a high degree of certainty. What we've heard from the head of CSIS at committee, from David Morrison, the Deputy Minister of Global Affairs, is that these aren't necessarily all high-confidence intelligence reports. Some of this is raw intelligence, it's unverified, and it's not at the same level of certainty, certainly that the U.S. intelligence apparatus had on Putin's military ambitions. So I take your point, but there's a different level of confidence, right?
Well, not in all respects. I agree with you. If they have low confidence in the intelligence, then it should not be made public. But there are many aspects of Beijing's foreign interference which CSIS has clearly concluded they have a high degree of confidence in. We know that from documents that we've obtained from CSIS at the Procedure and House Affairs Committee. It's clear that they've identified Beijing as a source of this interference, that they have a high degree of confidence that they are engaged in certain activities. That is the kind of information, the details of which should be made public.
So in the short term, you'd like to see the government declassify information on who exactly was targeted so political parties can defend themselves and defend their campaigns. Because in the long term, a public inquiry is going to take a long time, right? And so how do we get ready for the next election?
Well, one thing they should do is admit that the election protocol, the site task force, the Security and Intelligence Threats to Elections task force that they keep referring to didn't work in the last election. We know that because documents that we've obtained from Global Affairs Canada's G7 rapid response mechanism highlight that Global Affairs was tracking in real time the Chinese Communist Party's disinformation campaign that was targeting candidates like Kenny Chiu in Steveston, Richmond East. But they did nothing. It was like they were watching a drowning man drown.
Well, they said
they
couldn't verify in real time that it was foreign or state-sponsored and not just run-of-the-mill disinformation, for lack of a better term.
No, what the Rosenberg report concluded was that the threshold to release this information was too high.
But so in the testimony, they said this, that they couldn't conclude it. It was Jody Thomas who said it.
Well, I disagree with Jody Thomas because if you look at what the G7 rapid response mechanism document said, it clearly identified the Chinese Communist Party as the source of this disinformation campaign targeting candidate Kennedy Chiu. And I think that should have met the threshold required to release that information to Kenny Chiu and to the public during the campaign. The irony of that report is that it even took note of candidate Kenny Chiu's him being overwhelmed during the campaign by disinformation that he had never seen before, but he wasn't certain of the source it was coming from. Meanwhile, Global Affairs Canada identified the source as the Chinese Communist Party and even highlighted how they obscured the source of that information over the course of a week. So clearly the protocol didn't work. So the government should begin by fixing the protocol so that this kind of information is made public.
Right, and that was one of the recommendations Morris Rosenberg had in his report, that maybe the threshold there needs to be lower than completely tilting the election and to deal with these one-on-one things. So we got this situation where we are going to get a special rapporteur at some point. I don't know if there's someone who can satisfy the Conservatives on this. I mean, does this have any legitimacy with you? If it is an eminent person, if it is someone maybe who's been appointed by Stephen Harper to public office at some point, is there any path forward where this process of a special rapporteur making the call on an inquiry can be acceptable to the Conservatives?
Yes, I think if that person, if the special rapporteur recommends a public inquiry and the person selected to head up the public inquiry has the support of all the recognized parties in the House of Commons, then I think you would see broad support for that. But in parallel to that, the government also needs to release this information. It can't be used as a tool to deflect and delay taking immediate action on countering this foreign interference.
What if it's someone all the opposition parties support and is acceptable to the Conservatives, and they don't recommend an inquiry? They say it's not necessary and it's not appropriate. What kind of a political situation do we find ourselves in then?
Well, that all depends on what the government does in the meantime with the Procedure and House Affairs investigation that's going on right now. It depends what they do with releasing other information. Look, CSIS has been clear. Other intelligence agencies of our Five Eyes Alliance have been clear. Translating intelligence into evidence for an investigation, a prosecution, often is very difficult. So a tool available to governments to counter foreign interference that can't lead or doesn't lead to an investigation and a prosecution is to use sunlight and transparency, to make public the details and the individuals involved in foreign interference as a way to counter it. This is something the government has refused to do. It's refused to follow the best practices of Western democratic intelligence agencies. And so if the government has a change of heart after public pressure and comes forward with more details about what is going on, then perhaps the Procedure and House Affairs Committee, Parliament can do its job, and we may not need a public inquiry. But if they continue to stonewall and they refuse to heed the advice of intelligence agencies, then we need a real public inquiry that's going to get to the bottom of this so that we can prevent this from happening again in the future. But I think we need both. We need both a public inquiry and the government to come clean about what they know. And
okay, we also wanted to dig into the intelligence aspect of these recommendations, so let's break down what new security measures are being introduced. First, Justin Trudeau will appoint a special rapporteur, an eminent, independent, and unimpeachable person to investigate the allegations at hand. They'll make recommendations, and one of them could be to launch a public inquiry. 2 more investigations are being launched, one within the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians. It's made up of 4 Liberal MPs, 2 Conservatives, 1 New Democrat, 1 member of the Bloc Québécois, and 1 senator. They have top-secret security clearance, but they'll meet behind closed doors and will be limited in what they can report publicly. Also tasked with an investigation, the National Security and Intelligence Review Agency. It's made up of independent experts, and they'll specifically look into how Canada's intelligence agencies have handled this threat. Okay, so will these new measures be effective? Jessica Davis is the president of Insight Threat Intelligence, and Thomas Juneau is an associate professor at the University of Ottawa's Graduate School of Public and International Affairs. And of course, we're keeping our eye on Parliament Hill. We're going to hear from the President of the European Commission, but I want to start this conversation. Thank you both for joining me. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Jess, I'd like to start with you high level. I mean, where do you come down on what has been announced by the government in terms of trying to address this issue? Politically, this is not at all acceptable to the opposition parties. How do people in the national security world view this?
There's been a number of things that the Prime Minister has announced that are actually already underway. So, for instance, the Foreign Agent Registry was already announced in December. The introduction of NSICOP, our Committee of Parliamentarians, and our National Intelligence Review Agency, and CIRA, are welcome, I think, into this conversation, because they're really the ones who have the subject matter expertise, the security clearances to really get to the bottom of this. But their mandates are quite limited. So, and CIRA is going to be really focusing on looking at the information passage that happened between national security agencies and the government. And NSICOP has a bit more of a broader mandate, but still, we're not talking about looking at, for example, the government's response to foreign interference in the elections.
Right. So, Professor Juneau, NSICOP and CIRA, these are organizations with top secret national security clearance. They will look at these things in private. Where do you come down on this debate between leaving it there or having this public inquiry that is the political push right now?
On the issue of the public inquiry, I see benefits with a public inquiry if it does end up happening, if the special rapporteur does end up recommending one. It's not a bad thing. It can be helpful in many ways. The accountability, the transparency that would come with that. But if for whatever reason the rapporteur, once we know who it is, decides not to recommend one, I do think that what the package of measures that was announced by the government yesterday can be useful to make things, to get some progress forward. And CIRA and SICOP, as Jessica just mentioned, they each have their own niche. They each have their own mandate. The elections commissioner is looking at this. The Foreign Agents Registry was, at some point will come forward. Another element that was announced yesterday that gets less attention because it's a bit more in the bureaucratic weeds, but the announcement that at Public Safety Canada there would be some kind of a foreign intelligence coordinator. All of these taken together individually, they're not miracle solutions, but all of them together I think can be useful going forward, assuming that they're taken seriously, of course.
Right. So, Jess, if these measures are taken seriously and allowed to do the work they're being tasked to do, they seem like an effective way to attack the problem. But the public inquiry seems like the way to attack the outrage and the concern, if that makes sense, if I'm parsing it correctly. I mean, what's your sense of how it should play out?
Yeah, I personally don't really think that a public inquiry is going to do a lot for us in terms of outcomes and actual fixing some of the problems, because we know what a lot of the problems are. We know about the problems of not having foreign agents registered. We know about the problem of lack of enforcement of some of our existing laws, some of those relating to foreign elections, or rather elections, some of them relating to lobbying. So some of these laws are already on the book. So we don't really need an inquiry to get to the bottom of that. I agree with Thomas that there could be some benefit in terms of airing some of this information publicly, but it's a big bill, a big cost to pay for that kind of outcome. The other issue, too, that Thomas rightly mentioned is the lack of a coordinator on foreign interference in Canada. The lack of somebody who's really accountable and responsible for delivering outcomes for the government has been one of the major things that has plagued our foreign interference investigations and program writ large. And so this is an important step to fixing that.
So, Thomas, the person that's going to be in charge of a lot of things right now is this special rapporteur. We don't know who it's going to be, but we know they're being given a lot of responsibility by the Prime Minister, including the decision on whether or not there will be a public inquiry. I mean, who would want this, but who sort of fits the bill to take on this particular job?
I'm not in a position to speculate as to who that person could be. I think one point that I think is worth mentioning on the rapporteur is that if, hypothetically, the government had announced yesterday a public inquiry, that public inquiry would have, its terms of reference, its mandate, its parameters, its leader would have been chosen, determined by the government. One possible benefit, if we actually want to see real progress on this issue, putting aside the partisan screaming and yelling, is that this rapporteur, assuming, and that may be a big if, but assuming that it is an eminent, impartial, credible, qualified Canadian, will make recommendations on whether we should hold an inquiry, including its parameters, its terms of reference, etc. So if what we want is an inquiry that is relevant and has the right terms of reference, then that rapporteur will be able to make those recommendations as opposed to the government determining that all on its own.
Right. So Jess Davis, do you have any idea of who could do this, or at least what kind of background and skill set and knowledge base they would need to bring to this job, and how they would structure an inquiry that would satisfy all the political anxieties that are out there?
Well, for the special rapporteur, I think the list is really short about who it could potentially be. We're looking at probably former deputy ministers who have served in national security portfolios, maybe an former assistant deputy minister that served in a national security portfolio, maybe some retired judges. But this is not a long list of people who would have the requisite skill set and knowledge to do that work. And then the inquiry is an entirely different question, and one that I honestly hope we don't get to. I hope that the special rapporteur can really provide a little bit more guidance so that we can take action on these issues now, because the next election could happen really at any point now, and we're not ready.
Right. So just build on that. I mean, what do we need to do to get ready? Because I don't know what a public inquiry will do, because it needs to be the terms of reference. We need to see exactly how it would function, all of the things that Thomas outlined. But the election, as you say, we are in a minority parliament and it could happen, and the foreign interference is not likely to sit this one out. So what needs to be done, like in the next couple of months, to try to address these challenges?
Yeah, so I think that a few of the things are really important. So getting that foreign agent registry, the issue with that, of course, is making sure that it's addressing all of the different levels of potential foreign interference. So we're talking about municipal, provincial, and federal, because we know that foreign interference is happening at all those different levels. So that's a huge task, one that's not going to be sorted in the next 3 months, but we can make a big push for it. I think the other thing, too, is making sure that people are aware that there is a reporting mechanism for foreign interference. It's through the CSIS website, and just making sure that Canadians feel empowered to report potential foreign interference. Thankfully, the one good thing that's happened out of all of this is it's really highlighted the issue of foreign interference in our elections and made people aware of it in a way that I haven't seen in the Canadian national security dialogue before. So that's one good step in terms of getting ready for that next election.
Thomas, it seems to me that the foreign agent registry needs to be properly calibrated, because you run the risk of capturing people you don't want to capture in something like that. But the hotline, or the way to report foreign interference that Jess outlined, that needs to be amplified. I think from talking to people, in the Chinese Canadian community and diaspora community, just about the concerns there needs to be like a national hotline number or some more direct way than the CSIS website to report these things.
I agree with that. So a couple of points. First of all, on the issue of the foreign registry and what you broadly mentioned, it is absolutely legitimate to criticize the government for not having moved ahead earlier on this. This is something that has been discussed for a long time, but irrespective of what has and has not been done in the past, now that the government, I hope, genuinely wants to move ahead with this, it has to proceed cautiously, as you said, because when you introduce new national security tools through legislation or otherwise, if you don't proceed cautiously, if you don't consult with allies, with civil society, with other levels of government, as Jessica said, you risk not getting it right. And not getting it right is not helpful, and it risks, as we've seen in the past after 9/11, for example, catching in its dragnet people that are innocent, for example, in diaspora communities. So yes, let's move ahead with this, but let's take our time. as part of these consultations, what else should come? Transparency, engagement. There's really a need, as Jessica said, there's been progress, but there's really a need for the government, for the national security community to be much more proactive in establishing means of dialogue with diaspora communities, Chinese Canadians in the case that we're talking about right now, but it also goes to Indian Canadians, to Saudi Canadians, to Iranian Canadians, and so on. So I hope that proper channels do come out of this.
So Jess Davis, just sort of a final point, I guess. The measures on NSIRA and NSI COP and things announced yesterday were kind of new. They'll process things that the political opponents have rejected. The other measures, a lot of it was catching up on homework, right? It was things that have been recommended for years and not acted on. So, I mean, what does that tell us about how urgently this government responds to national security concerns, which aren't necessarily front page news until, 2 weeks ago?
I wouldn't necessarily say it's just this government that doesn't respond to national security news or do the required work for national security. This has been something that's plagued Canadian politics for decades. We don't really have a culture of embracing national security issues in our political debates. That's changing, and I'm really happy to see that. But that's one of the things that, in this world of foreign interference, we really need to get our hands on. The other thing that wasn't announced that is really missing from this, again, is that enforcement piece. If we don't have enforcement of our existing and new laws and better tools within the RCMP, including resources, these are just laws in the books. These will not be effective.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. I really appreciate your insight. And I can tell you, it's changed the national security conversation on this show. We're having all kinds of experts in your field on these days. But Jessica Davis, Juneau, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Thanks, David.